Chapter 4. The First Cities. With the return of writing and the systematic recording of knowledge, a new phase in human history began, the rise of the first cities. These cities were not merely clusters of houses or centers of trade, but organic living hubs of existence, places where the principles of the age of silence, patience, observation, harmony with nature, met the newfound ability to preserve and transmit knowledge. The choice of location was crucial. Cities arose along rivers that provided fresh water and transport, in sheltered valleys that offered protection from nature's whims, and on hills that granted a strategic view of the surrounding land. Each city grew organically. Its streets and paths followed the natural contours of the terrain, never rigid or artificially planned. Buildings were made of clay, wood, and stone. Roofs were often covered with moss or grasses, allowing them to blend seamlessly into the landscape while also offering climatic benefits. Public squares and gardens were integral parts of the cities. Squares served not only for gathering, but also for observing weather patterns, animal movements, and celestial phenomena. Rooftop or courtyard gardens provided food, medicinal plants, and a sense of symbolic order. Every part of the city had multiple dimensions: functional, aesthetic, and philosophical. Architecture reflected the people's understanding of balance between order and nature. Social structures in these cities evolved just as organically. Writing made it possible to record rules, laws, and agreements. Elders and teachers organized daily life, guided trade, education, and protection, but power was never absolute. It was bound to wisdom, patience, and responsibility. Every action, whether planting a field, building a house, or choosing a water route, was weighed carefully with regard to its long-term consequences. The cities were also centers of observation and learning. The earlier mistakes of humankind, misguided technology, reckless interference with nature, were studied and analyzed. Remnants of machines from the old world served as teaching tools. Their mechanisms were deciphered, and their principles adapted for the new cities. Children grew up in a culture that combined practical skills with philosophical reflection. They learned to read the signs of nature, interpret waterways, construct stable buildings, and decode written symbols. Trade and communication between cities slowly began to emerge, first along rivers, later through the building of paths and bridges. Cities like Lysa, Murith, and Theon stood at the beginning of this network. Yet the cities were not merely centers of exchange, but also of research, art, and meditation. Great halls were dedicated to the preservation of knowledge. Small observatories on rooftops allowed for astronomical studies. Platforms and towers became centers for the observation of flora, fauna, and weather. The cities taught a new form of community. Cooperation and responsibility were their cornerstones, not power or coercion. Each city had its own customs, rituals, and ceremonies, yet they were united by the principles of patience, observation, and harmony. Mistakes and carelessness brought immediate consequences, not only for individuals but for the whole community. And yet these errors were documented, analyzed, and understood to teach future generations. Architecture itself was an expression of philosophy. Streets followed the natural slope of the land. Squares were designed to make optimal use of water and wind. Houses were built to provide shelter while fostering connection between interior and exterior. Cities were organic systems, blending the knowledge of the ancients with the experiences of the Silent Age, places where life, work, observation, and culture were inseparably intertwined. The first cities marked the transition from isolated, voiceless communities to networks united by knowledge, observation, and responsibility. They were not merely places of survival, but living teachers. In their streets, gardens, halls, and observatories, the essence of the Third Age was reflected: the balance between humankind, knowledge, and nature. Chapter 5. The Era of Alliances. With the growth of the first cities came the necessity to think beyond their own borders. The cities of the Third Age realized that survival, progress, and the preservation of knowledge could no longer remain confined to individual communities. Thus began the Era of Alliances, a time in which cooperation and trust became more important than power or violence, and in which knowledge, resources, and responsibility were interwoven. The first alliances were cautious and local. Neighboring cities exchanged supplies, seeds, tools, and knowledge. These early agreements were carefully recorded, often in air script on wooden tablets, parchment, or stone. The records established rules for trade, disaster relief, and shared observation of nature. Each agreement was also a lesson. It showed that trust must be built, and that patience and attentiveness are the foundations of lasting cooperation. Over time, complex networks emerged. Cities such as Lisa, Mureth, Theon, Arvin, and Serath became connected through rivers, trade routes, and eventually the newly discovered airways. Each connection was more than mere transport. It was a conduit for knowledge, experience, and cultural exchange. Teachers, observers, and chroniclers traveled between the cities to share their insights. Rituals and festivals were introduced to celebrate the alliances, to strengthen their rules, and to emphasize the responsibility of every individual toward the community. The alliances also had philosophical dimensions. They taught that power without wisdom is destructive, that security can only be achieved through cooperation, and that every action carries long-term consequences for others. Conflicts were resolved through negotiation, mediation, and sometimes symbolic trials, never through sheer violence. The network of cities was alive, constantly shifting, a dynamic balance of responsibility, experience, and mutual care. Trade and communication became increasingly complex. Goods were not only transported, but also evaluated, catalogued, and improved. Methods of agriculture, water management, and architecture were exchanged, refined, and adapted to new environmental conditions. Air routes and rivers allowed for the rapid sharing of observations about climate, animal migrations, and natural disasters, making the cities better prepared and more resilient. The alliances also brought about a new form of social organization. Roles were clearly defined. Observers documented nature and society, custodians preserved knowledge and records, traders organized resources, and teachers educated the younger generations. Yet every role remained flexible and dependent on mutual support. No city could exist in isolation, and the balance between autonomy and cooperation became the central principle of this era. The era of alliances strengthened the sense of responsibility. Every city, every alliance, and every action was examined, observed, and documented. Mistakes were analyzed and understood to serve future generations. This practice gave rise to a collective wisdom that went beyond individual experience. Knowledge was no longer possession, but a shared good. Moreover, the alliances taught humankind not to see nature merely as a resource, but as a partner. Decisions regarding fields, waterways, fishing grounds, and forests were made collectively, taking into account signs, observations, and long-term consequences. Cities that refused to accept these principles vanished, while those that lived in harmony grew and flourished. During this time, the first forms of law and ethics emerged, not as abstract decrees but as living practice. Rules that ensured survival, preserved wisdom, and maintained balance between humanity, community, and nature. The alliances taught patience, cooperation, responsibility, and respect, principles that would shape the Third Age far into the future. Thus, the era of alliances marks a turning point. From isolated cities to interconnected societies, sharing knowledge, culture, and responsibility. The cities had become more than mere places of survival. They were living centers of progress, where every action was measured in the mirror of community and nature. The Third Age had given rise to its first great networks, and with them, the possibility of preserving and passing on the teachings of the ancients. Chapter 6. The Discovery of the Airways. In the era of alliances, when the lands of humankind were bound no longer by rivers, valleys, or mountains alone, the gaze of men and women lifted toward the heavens. A vision was born, that the sky itself could be traversed, tamed, and understood. Thus began the age of the airways, a time when the winds became roads, the clouds became guides, and the very currents of the atmosphere carried the destiny of nations. The first flights were fragile and daring. Sails of woven fabric, wooden platforms lifted upon unseen gusts, kites sent aloft as eyes to watch the land below. Yet these early attempts revealed a truth. The air was not merely a medium, but a teacher, a guardian of wisdom and patience. Every wind held counsel, every bird in flight a lesson. Those who listened found safe passage, those who defied its signs vanished or returned changed, touched by the sublime. The airways transformed the world. Cities no longer languished in isolation. The gifts of earth, food, medicine, tools, and scrolls traveled swiftly. Observers roamed from city to city, carrying knowledge, coordinating discoveries and weaving bonds stronger than stone walls. Trade and culture flowed through the skies, and the world, once fragmented, became a living web of connection, bound by wind, cloud, and the silent wings of birds. To command the skies required mastery in body, mind, and spirit. Pilots learned the language of the currents, the subtle lifts of warm air, and the ever-changing face of the heavens. Artisans blended ancient wisdom with the quiet observations of the era of silence, forging craft that were light as feathers yet strong as iron. Every successful flight was a triumph, not of force, but of patience, insight, and attunement to the subtle rhythms of the world. The airways carried lessons beyond the practical. They taught that freedom and responsibility are inseparable, that opportunity and peril ride together on every breeze. Those who mastered the skies could shape the world, connect cities, and spread knowledge, but only by honoring the weight of their choices. Each journey was a rite, a testament to courage, balance, and wisdom. Over time, the paths of the air were marked. Towers arose as sentinels, observation posts guided travelers, and symbols traced safe corridors through the heavens. Children were instructed in the arts of navigation, workshops nurtured masters of craft and thought. The airways became sacred symbols, linking knowledge, duty, and progress in an unbreakable chain. Science, too, took to the skies. From elevated platforms, astronomers read the movements of stars and planets. Weather revealed its hidden codes. The migrations of animals could be seen in their entirety, unfolding like living maps. The air became a medium of exploration, a bridge between realms, a lens through which the mysteries of the world were revealed. The discovery of the airways marked the turning of an era. Cities were no longer solitary bastions of humanity. They became nodes in a vast, breathing network. Knowledge, art, commerce, and philosophy coursed through the skies with unprecedented speed. The heavens instilled patience, reverence, and mindfulness in all who dared to ascend. Thus, the airways were not merely paths of travel, they were instruments of destiny. They elevated the principles of the third era to the heights of legend. In every flight, every observation, every return, the airways inscribed stories of courage, wisdom, and enduring patience. A celestial epic written upon the winds. And so it was foretold. Humanity that masters the skies shall weave the world into a living tapestry, guided by the invisible hands of the air and the eternal lesson that freedom and responsibility are forever bound.